On January 28, 2025, 8 days after Donald Trump was inaugurated as the 47th President of the United States, employees at the Pentagon were using a Chinese AI chatbot on government-issued devices to test its capabilities. Not retirees, not contractors working from home. People inside the Department of Defense connected to Pentagon networks, routing their queries through servers operated by a Hangzhou-based artificial intelligence startup called DeepSeek. The Defense Information Systems Agency discovered the connections through routine network traffic monitoring, specifically by tracking the IP addresses and server destinations of outgoing data from government computers. It began blocking access to DeepSeek's platforms on January 28th. Some employees continued accessing it anyway. Repeated connection attempts triggered additional alerts. A full network-wide block was implemented by January 30th. During the post-incident audit, cybersecurity teams discovered that earlier downloads of DeepSeek code had occurred from government devices as far back as the fall of 2024. Months before anyone in official Washington had publicly identified DeepSeek as a national security concern. At the time, according to the audit findings, the Chinese affiliation wasn't flagged due to incomplete threat intelligence. 2 days. That is how long the United States Department of Defense, the most powerful military institution in the history of the world, the organization that controls the largest defense budget on Earth, the organization whose cybersecurity apparatus is supposed to represent the gold standard of operational security, spent unwittingly using a Chinese artificial intelligence system on its own networks before anyone noticed. And the reason nobody noticed immediately is the same reason this story matters more than any individual security lapse. DeepSeek's R1 model was, by the time Pentagon employees started using it, the most downloaded free application in the United States App Store. It had displaced ChatGPT. It had done so in days, and it had done so with a model that the House Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party's subsequent investigation determined was likely built partly through model distillation, a technique through which DeepSeek personnel had allegedly generated millions of calls from thousands of fraudulent accounts to the application programming interfaces of American AI companies, including Anthropic's Claude model series, systematically extracting their capabilities and using the outputs to train a competitor model. Anthropic confirmed this allegation in its own subsequent disclosure. The most advanced AI capabilities that American companies had spent hundreds of millions of dollars and years of engineering effort to develop had, according to these findings, been extracted through an API, through the front door, and used to build the competitor that then displaced those same American companies from the top of the US App Store within months. Marc Andreessen, the venture capitalist and co-founder of Netscape, whose firm Andreessen Horowitz has invested more in AI than almost any other entity in Silicon Valley, called DeepSeek's release AI's Sputnik Moment. That specific phrase, Sputnik Moment, is not casual hyperbole. The original Sputnik Moment on October 4th, 1957, was when the Soviet Union launched the world's first artificial satellite, and the United States discovered that a rival it had been confident it was outpacing had leapfrogged it in a domain it had not been paying adequate attention to. The response to that original Sputnik Moment was ARPA, the Advanced Research Projects Agency, the precursor to DARPA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, a dramatic increase in federal science and engineering education funding, and a decade-long national mobilization around a single technological objective that culminated in the Apollo program and a moon landing in 1969. The question that Andreessen's phrase implicitly poses, the question that every person paying attention to what happened in January 2025 and everything that followed should be sitting with, is whether the American response to this particular Sputnik Moment is anything close to the scale and seriousness of the response to the original. By the time you finish watching this video, you are going to understand exactly what DeepSeek built, what the Pentagon's specific response to it reveals about the state of American AI defense strategy, what the House Select Committee on the CCP's investigation actually found when it examined how DeepSeek was built and who was behind it, what the phrase "the Pentagon's AI edge is being distilled away," published by the War on the Rocks Defense Policy Journal in June 2026, actually means for American military AI superiority, and why the honest answer to whether the United States has responded to this Sputnik Moment at anything close to the scale required is more uncomfortable than either the reassuring official statements or the panicked headlines suggest. Stay with me, because the story of what happened after January 20th, 2025 is more important than the story of the model itself, and the response tells you more about the state of American AI strategy than the benchmark scores do. Let's start with what DeepSeek actually built, using the specific numbers that make the technical achievement precise rather than general. DeepSeek R1, released publicly on January 20th, 2025, is a reasoning model, a category of AI systems specifically designed for multi-step logical inference, mathematical problem solving, and code generation, as distinct from the simpler instruction following models that dominated the first generation of consumer AI chatbots. Its disclosed training compute budget was approximately $5. $576 million in GPU rental costs, according to DeepSeek's own technical report, confirmed across multiple independent analyses. OpenAI's GPT-4, released in 2023, was estimated to have cost between $50 million and $100 million to train, according to CEO Sam Altman's public statements and third-party analysis. The cost difference between those two figures, $5, $576 million versus $50 million to $100 million, was not primarily a reflection of DeepSeek having less capable hardware or running fewer training steps. It was a reflection of a set of specific architectural and training methodology innovations that DeepSeek had developed, and that, when the technical paper was released alongside the model, the AI research community outside China spent the following weeks studying with a kind of focused intensity that accompanies a genuine engineering surprise. The two innovations that drew the most attention were the mixture of experts architecture at scale and the group relative policy optimization training methodology. The mixture of experts approach, in which a model routes each input to only a subset of its total parameters rather than activating the entire parameter count for every query, was not invented by DeepSeek. It had been used by other labs, including Google's Gemini team. What DeepSeek demonstrated was that it could be implemented at a scale and with an efficiency that produced frontier competitive reasoning performance at a fraction of the inference cost of dense models, and that the training process itself could be made dramatically more compute efficient through GRPO, a reinforcement learning technique that DeepSeek developed to teach the model to reason through complex problems, without requiring the large human-labeled datasets that had previously been considered necessary for this kind of capability. The combination of those two innovations produced a model that performed comparably to OpenAI's O1 reasoning model on the American Institute of Mathematics AIME 2024 benchmark, and on Codeforce's programming competition problems, at a training cost that implied a fundamentally different economic logic for frontier AI development than the one Silicon Valley had spent 5 years building its investment thesis around. If you are finding this the kind of coverage that goes to the primary technical documents and the primary government reports, rather than repeating what someone said about what someone else wrote, subscribe now. This channel does this every single week. The button is right there. The House Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party's investigation into DeepSeek, whose report was published in early 2025 and is available publicly on the committee's official website, makes a set of specific factual claims that go significantly beyond the performance comparison and that deserve to be stated precisely rather than paraphrased. The committee found that it is highly likely that DeepSeek used model distillation techniques to create an imitation AI model, copying leading U.S. AI models' capabilities and violating U.S. companies' terms of service. The committee stated specifically that DeepSeek personnel infiltrated U.S. AI companies, the report uses that word, infiltrated, to systematically extract model capabilities through API access. The committee found that DeepSeek's data harvesting architecture is entangled with Chinese companies with documented roles in surveillance and CCP control, identifying specifically ByteDance, which it described as having been caught tracking journalists, Baidu, which it described as having played a central role in China's censorship regime, and Tencent, which the Department of Defense had designated as a Chinese military company. The committee also found that cybersecurity researchers at Faroot Security had uncovered hard-coded data transfer mechanisms in DeepSeek's application that route user data to Chinese servers, and that PRC-affiliated social media accounts had amplified and celebrated the model's release in ways that the research firm Graphica documented as coordinated. Anthropic's own disclosure, made independently of the congressional investigation, was the most specific piece of evidence for the distillation claim. The company confirmed that it had identified what the War on the Rocks analysis from June 2026 described as Chinese labs including DeepSeek and Moonshot AI generating millions of calls from thousands of fraudulent accounts to the APIs of Anthropic's Claude model series to systematically extract its capabilities. The War on the Rocks piece, titled The Pentagon's AI Edge is Being Distilled Away, and published approximately 17 months after DeepSeek's initial release, makes an argument that is important precisely because it comes from a defense policy journal rather than from a technology trade publication. That model distillation, the technique through which Chinese AI labs appear to have been extracting American frontier model capabilities, cannot be stopped by hardware export controls. Even the most draconian hardware export controls cannot restrict the flow of frontier model outputs that are used for distillation, the piece states. The primary doorway to frontier models is their application programming interface. Every time a frontier model is accessed via an API, its response effectively leaks its costly intelligence to anyone with a subscription. The implication is that the United States government's primary strategy for maintaining AI superiority, restricting China's access to the most advanced semiconductors through the export control regime that has been progressively tightened since 2022, addresses only one of the two primary pathways through which Chinese AI labs are narrowing the capability gap, and that the second pathway, the distillation of existing American model capabilities through commercial API access, remains essentially unaddressed by any policy measure currently in place. The Pentagon's response to DeepSeek's January 2025 release was, in its immediate phase, swift in the specific form of banning it. The Defense Information Systems Agency blocked access to DeepSeek across Pentagon IT networks on January 28, 2025, the same day the network monitoring tools identified the unauthorized connections. The U.S. Navy issued a memo to service members on January 24th, prohibiting the use of DeepSeek's AI models in any capacity, citing potential security and ethical concerns. NASA issued a similar directive to its personnel on January 31st. New York Governor Kathy Hochul announced a statewide ban on DeepSeek on government-managed devices on February 10th, citing serious concerns related to foreign government surveillance and censorship. Virginia followed on February 11th with Governor Glenn Youngkin's Executive Order 46, which prohibited any state employee or contractor from downloading or using DeepSeek on state-issued devices or through state-owned networks. Representatives Gottheimer and LaHood introduced the No DeepSeek on Government Devices Act on February 7th. Senator Josh Hawley introduced the U.S.-China AI decoupling bill on January 29th, which would effectively ban the use of DeepSeek's AI models in the United States entirely. The White House confirmed an ongoing review by the National Security Council to evaluate DeepSeek's implications for U.S. national security. President Trump called DeepSeek a wake-up call for the American technology sector and said the United States needed to remain laser-focused on winning the AI race. All of that happened in the 17 days between January 20th and February 7th, 2025. What is striking about that sequence is not its pace, it is what it tells you about the specific form of the response. Every single action in that list is a restriction. A ban, a prohibition, a block, a legislative proposal to sever access. Not one of the 17-day response items is a construction. A new funding commitment, a new research program, a new architectural initiative designed to close the underlying capability gap that had been revealed, a new strategy for protecting American frontier AI capabilities from API-based distillation, or a new policy framework for the specific question of how the United States maintains its AI development advantage at a moment when the training efficiency innovations that DeepSeek published openly in its technical paper have already propagated across the global AI research community and cannot be unpublished. Subscribe now, because what I'm about to cover in the next section is the dimension of this story that the ban headlines missed entirely. The specific evidence for what China is building at the hardware layer underneath the model layer, and why the export control strategy that represents the American government's primary defensive mechanism is confronting a set of engineering developments that are making its enforcement progressively more complicated. The Pentagon's December 2025 report to Congress on China's military developments, released according to Defense Scoop's December 26, 2025 reporting, quietly in the days before the Christmas holiday, stated the following in official language. In 2024, China's commercial and academic AI sectors made progress on large language models and LLM-based reasoning models, which has narrowed the performance gap between China's models and the U.S. models currently leading the field. That sentence is from the Department of Defense's own official annual assessment of Chinese military capability, released on the schedule that minimizes public attention. Not from a trade publication, not from an advocacy group. The Pentagon's own report to Congress, stating that China's AI progress in 2024 had narrowed the performance gap with U.S. frontier models. Underneath that model-level progress sits a hardware development program, whose specific numbers deserve precise attention. Huawei, which was added to the United States Entity List in May 2019, has been developing its own line of AI accelerator chips, the Ascend series, as the domestic alternative to NVIDIA's graphics processing units. At the Huawei Connect 2025 conference on September 18, 2025, Huawei's rotating chairman Eric Su Zhijun unveiled a specific multi-year chip roadmap for the first time. The Ascend 950 PR, designed for AI inference prefill operations, was planned for the first quarter of 2026. The Ascend 950 DT, designed for decoding and training, was planned for the fourth quarter of 2026. The Ascend 960 was planned for the fourth quarter of 2027. The Ascend 970 for the fourth quarter of 2028. Each of those chips is designed to carry Huawei-designed high-bandwidth memory, meaning Huawei is developing the memory components in-house as well as the compute architecture, specifically to reduce its dependency on the South Korean and Japanese HBM suppliers that American export controls have been progressively restricting. Bloomberg's September 29, 2025 reporting, confirmed by multiple independent sources, stated that Huawei planned to manufacture approximately 600,000 units of its Ascend 910C chip in 2026, roughly double its 2025 production level, with total Ascend series output across all models potentially reaching 6 million dies in the same year. The Semi-Analysis newsletter's February 4, 2026. Analysis of Huawei's production constraints identified the specific bottleneck that is currently limiting that ambition: high bandwidth memory. China's domestic HBM producer, Changxin Memory Technologies, is projected to produce approximately 2 million HBM stacks in 2026, which is sufficient for between 250,000 and 300,000 Ascend 910C equivalent packages, considerably less than the 600,000 units Huawei wants to manufacture. China had accumulated approximately 13 million HBM stacks, primarily from Samsung, before export controls, and a September 2025 Beijing directive tightened restrictions on HBM exports to China, according to the Semi-Analysis analysis. Those accumulated stockpiles supported Ascend production through 2024 and into 2025. Without access to additional foreign HBM, Semi-Analysis concluded, Huawei will not be able to fabricate even 1 million Ascend chips in 2026 because CMIC, China's domestic advanced chip foundry, can produce the silicon dies in sufficient quantity. But without the memory packages, those dies cannot be assembled into functional AI accelerators. The Tom's hardware analysis of the same production constraints, published September 10, 2025, added a layer of complexity that further complicates the clean narrative of American export controls being effective. Tech Insights teardowns of Ascend 910B and 920C chips, the most advanced Huawei AI accelerators, found that essentially every sample examined contained dies manufactured at TSMC's 7nm node rather than SMIC's. The House Select Committee report confirmed this. Huawei acquired approximately 2 9 million TSMC 7nm dies through SoftGo, a Cayman Islands registered company, in what appears to have been a sanctions circumvention arrangement. SoftGo subsequently appeared on the Commerce Department's entity list. But the dies had already been manufactured, already been acquired, and had already been used in Ascend 910B and 910C chips that were already deployed in Chinese AI data centers, supporting the training runs that produced the DeepSeek models and the Qwen models and everything else that has been described as Chinese AI's great leap forward. The hardware embargo that was supposed to prevent China from training frontier AI models was, in this specific documented instance, circumvented through a supply chain arrangement involving a Cayman Islands shell company and TSMC's foundry services. And the chips that resulted are already inside the infrastructure that is making Chinese AI competitive. The War on the Rocks piece from June 2026 asks the specific question that the banning and blocking and legislative proposal phase of the American response did not address. What is the Pentagon actually going to do about the AI edge being distilled away through API access? The piece notes that the DoD wants nearly $30 billion to modernize its AI supercomputing arsenal in fiscal year 2027, according to Defense Scoop reporting. It notes that the DoD wants more than $2 billion in fiscal 2027 to move beyond what it describes as fragmented CJADC2 deployments, the combined joint all-domain command and control architecture that is supposed to integrate AI-driven decision-making across military branches. These are real budget requests. They reflect a genuine institutional awareness at the Pentagon that the AI competition has reached a stage where defensive restrictions alone, banning DeepSeek from government devices, tightening export controls on Huawei's chip supply chain, are not sufficient as a strategy for maintaining American military AI superiority. But budget requests and strategy documents are not the same as operational capability, and the specific form of the threat identified in the War on the Rocks analysis, that American frontier model capabilities are being systematically extracted through commercial API access faster than any hardware control can address, does not have a clear solution anywhere in the current policy landscape. The DoD's December 2025 China Military Power Report states that Beijing has been catching up in the race for new generative AI capabilities. The War on the Rocks analysis, published June 2026, states that the Pentagon's AI edge is being distilled away. The House Select Committee report states that DeepSeek likely used American AI models' own outputs as training data to build a competitor. The Semi-Analysis analysis confirms that the chips inside China's most advanced domestic AI accelerators were manufactured at TSMC before the export controls fully prevented it. And the specific response of the world's most powerful military institution to all of this was, in its first 17 days, a series of bans on its own employees using a Chinese app, followed by budget requests and strategy documents that will take years to translate into operational capability. That is not a description of a Sputnik response. The original Sputnik response produced DARPA in 18 months and a moon landing in 12 years. What the American institutional response to DeepSeek has produced in 17 months is a more complete export control regime, a ban on government devices, a congressional investigation, and a set of defense budget requests that are still making their way through the appropriations process. Each of those things is real, and each represents a genuine response to a genuine problem. None of them addresses the specific finding of the War on the Rocks analysis, that the most important pathway through which Chinese AI capability is accumulating is commercial API access to American frontier models, and that this pathway is open, operational, and generating results faster than any policy currently in place can close it. Here's the question I want to leave you with, because it is the one that has no comfortable answer from any direction. Mark Andreessen called DeepSeek's release AI's Sputnik Moment in January 2025. The original Sputnik Moment in October 1957 produced a response commensurate with the threat it revealed: a national mobilization, a new agency, a sustained commitment of federal resources to a technological competition that was understood to be existential. If the DeepSeek Moment is comparable in strategic significance to the Sputnik Moment, the question is whether the American response has been commensurate with that significance. The ban on government devices was implemented in days. The legislative proposals were introduced in weeks. The budget requests are moving through Congress in months. The new AI supercomputing infrastructure that the DoD wants will take years. The academic and engineering talent pipeline that would make American frontier AI development sustainably competitive requires decades. And in the meantime, the API through which Chinese labs are extracting American frontier model capabilities is still open, is still being accessed, and is still producing the distilled intelligence that the War on the Rocks analysis says is the most consequential pathway through which the Pentagon's AI edge is eroding. Tell me in the comments whether you think the American response to this Sputnik Moment is happening at the speed and scale that the threat requires. Because I think the honest answer requires acknowledging that banning an app and building a moon program are not the same thing. And if you want to keep following this story as it develops, the next DoD budget request, the next Chinese model release, the next congressional investigation, and the next War on the Rocks piece that documents what is happening to American AI superiority between the press conferences, subscribe now, because this is the most consequential technology competition of our lifetimes, and it is moving faster than any policy calendar can keep up with.